Good morning, all of you, for our, can you believe it? Our final meeting of the year. Yeah. Well done. We've made it. Just a quick reminder, there will be a quick video at the end that was produced by the new Mons, I think, about an upcoming dance, which is exciting. And I'm not going to talk about, I sometimes give advice about the last days, but I want to talk about a conversation I had with a graduate from 1945. And I gave this talk a title, and it's called, I Didn't Get a Diploma on Privilege and Service. And that's an unusual title, and you'll see where it comes from. And I begin by saying that sometimes in life you have conversations that become sort of lodged like a pebble in your shoe. They sometimes are unanticipated, they can be accidental, but you never get rid of them. They stay with you forever. And you hear those words for the rest of your life. And that was the case last week at an Alumni Day lunch, when I was in the choral room with members of what we call the Old Guard. And these are the men who graduated 50 years or longer. And I sat at a table with Alex Burnham, John Carson, Art Hilsinger, and Bill Rutter. These are four men from the class of 1945, which, of course, as you'll remember, was the final year of World War II. But before you hear about the conversation, and really, it was a single, simple utterance that one of them shared with me, you need to know something about the single most bloody and brutal battle of the Second World War, and it was called Okinawa. Some of you in AP US History or US History may remember it. By early 1945, US and Allied troops and forces were advancing on Japan, and they were steadily advancing across the Pacific, essentially in a brutal, slow, island-hopping campaign across the Pacific. But to defeat the Japanese, the Allies knew that they had to capture Okinawa. Okinawa, a small cluster of rocky islands about 350 miles from Japan, and they were needed in order to have airfields, in order to have places to stage troops, and for anchorage and harbor. And the battle that started in Okinawa lasted 82 days. It was the largest amphibious assault of the war. It enacted an absolutely horrific cost in human and military, and it ultimately, I think most would argue, brought about the end of the war. The campaign was the biggest of all the Pacific Island battles, and there were some terrible battles. It lasted from, and think about this, it lasted from April 1st through June 22nd, an 82-day battle. There were nearly 300,000 troops from the U.S. 10th Army, and they were thrown at about 130,000 soldiers of the Japanese 32nd Army. They knew that this battle was coming. They had fortified well. They had built concrete pillboxes and reinforcements. Both sides knew that ultimately the outcome of the war would probably be decided at Okinawa. If the Allies were successful, they would now have airfields from which they could launch attacks to Japan. And by the end of the campaign, and these numbers I think just are so mind-boggling, it's hard to get our arms around them. By the end of the campaign, Japan had lost more than 77,000 soldiers. Allies had suffered more than 65,000 casualties, 14,000 of those dead. The Navy suffered almost 5,000 killed and missing aboard 34 ships that were either sunk or damaged. Over 400 boats were badly damaged, 760 aircraft was lost. And in those 80 days, the forces that were thrown at the island and those that were defending it were beggar description. Survivors found it almost impossible to describe the hell that was that battle, but perhaps two metaphors, the typhoon of steel and the rain of steel used by the Americans and the Japanese respectively, may give a sense of the bloodletting in the air and on the waters and on the beaches and the mountains. Men died in all the horrible ways of war, from artillery shells, weapon fire, drowning, kamikaze attacks, bayonets, grenades, hand-to-hand combat, infections, napalm. By the end, nearly 250,000 people had died, soldiers and civilians, Japanese and American. And it was this toll, so extreme, so outrageous, so apocalyptic, that would serve as the rationale for the future use of the atomic bomb. 2 months later, the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki would end the war. And for the Americans involved at the highest level of that debate, I think there was considerable sense that if this is what it took, if this was the bloodletting, if this was the sacrifice it took simply to capture Okinawa, we needed a different way to end the war. So at lunch, our conversation turned to the war, of course, and if you talk to men who were at Taft from 1940 to 45, it always does. If you were Taft in those years, you couldn't escape the war. For instance, if you look at the head monitor board as you walk down the main hall sometime directly across my office, where you see all the men and women who've held that office, you'll see that the class of 1944 lists 3 names. And under these, in small print, it reads simply, war years. The quiet parenthetical phrase belies the truth that young men, boys really, sometimes left school to enlist. One day they were reading Shakespeare in their CPT dorm rooms. The next they were doing training runs in planes that were rushed off the assembly lines, or trying not to throw up in the hold of a Navy destroyer, or pulling on headphones to listen to radio communications, maybe slogging across the muddy battlefields of Belgium. The 1944 yearbook, for instance, is a lot like the 2015 one that just came out. Proud summaries of athletic seasons, formal photos of clubs, funny nicknames for classmates. But if you look closely, you'll see an explanation for the letter F or the letter J, indicating a February or a June graduation. And I quote, "Consequently, it will be noticed that there are 2 chairmen for many of the listed organizations." It's an odd, dispassionate observation, isn't it? Given that what really was happening was 18 and 19-year-olds were shaking hands with friends and teachers, leaving campus not knowing when they would return, and hence 2 chairmen for the club. You won't find one photograph of the school monitors. There are 2. The June to February group and the February to June group. Lots of senior pages do mention the college the graduate would be attending, but many don't. Instead, you read Navy, Navy V-12, U.S. Army, Navy Corps, U.S. Marines. So for those students in 1945, war was part of their life, part of every day. It's hard for us to even imagine that, isn't it? Boys read the newspaper avidly, and battle reports were intensely debated. Some took 3-hour civil defense shifts on a tower near the football field, watching out for enemy planes. This was happening, by the way, all over the nation. And it's so hard for us to imagine that there were students walking up to the football field, going up in a tower with a pair of binoculars and scanning the skies for airplanes. There was a commando training program which replaced the normal gym or calisthenics class. There was an obstacle course built on the golf course, very much like ones that young men would face when they went into training. The menu changed in the dining hall. Sugar and meat, of course, were rationed. Students led a scrap metal drive. Metal was collected and then turned over for military purposes. The fall formal dance was canceled. The headmaster felt that the cost and the celebration was inappropriate. 10 faculty served that year in some capacity. Graduates and current students signed up and then shipped out. In Headmaster's Crookshank letter in the alumni bulletin closed, "I've been thinking about all of you, scattered all over the world, in France, in Belgium, in New Guinea, the Philippines, China, Africa." By the end of the war, some 1,400 alumni had served. 59 graduates had been killed. They died in all the awful ways of war: accident, disease, wounds. And you're reminded of that when you look at the World War II Memorial Cabinet in Lincoln Lobby, which you pass every day. Many men died before they even saw combat. They died in training. And so you'll see deaths listed in Georgia, Florida, California, and Texas. My uncle, whom I never knew, was an Exeter graduate. He was one of those. Others died in the great campaigns, and you'll see those places: Italy, France, North Africa, the Pacific, Belgium, Germany. Remember, 23 of them were graduates from 1940 to 1945, young men, some about the same age as those who will receive a diploma this weekend. And it was these men from their reunion year in 1945 whom I had joined at lunch. They were gentlemen. They were warm, friendly, good sense of humor, men who had led dignified and good lives marked by accomplishment and humility. They could not have been more gracious to me. We chatted easily, sharing stories of Taft, me telling them about life on campus, laughing about the ways things have never changed. They were remembering classmates, favorite teachers. It was as pleasurable an hour as I've ever known. And so now we come to the comment I haven't forgotten. Somehow the topic of graduation came up. I don't know how. I think I was probably commenting on the week and hoping for good weather this weekend, and who knows. "Tell me about your graduation," I said. What do you recall of yours?" I asked. And one of them leaned over to me and said, "I didn't get a diploma. I was in Okinawa." You have to stop and think about what he just said in that quiet aside. Instead of doing his homework during study hall and maybe taking a pretty girl from Westover to the formal dance and then walking across the stage to get his diploma, what was he doing? He was hoping that he might live, he might survive in that 82-day hell called Okinawa. He had no graduation. He told me that he came back years later when he was visiting campus, and Headmaster Crookshank handed one to him. One of his classmates, he told me, served for 18 months and across all North Africa and the great battles of Europe, and was a semester short of graduation. When he came back, he actually lived in the dormitory. Can you imagine that? He lived in the dormitory, told it's lights out at 10:30. Time to do your calculus. A man who had fought across Europe. I don't think I'll ever forget that sentence. I hope you don't. I didn't have graduation. I was in Okinawa. Now, there's a moral of the story, several really. I tell it partly because on Monday our nation will celebrate Memorial Day. It's a day we remember the great sacrifices men and women have made to defend our freedoms. And you will walk the halls past a World War II memorial cabinet. Maybe you'll see those multiple names listed on the head monitor board. Perhaps you sing in Collegium and you see that great painting of Captain John Armstrong, class of '34, in uniform. Never forget them. We never should. They all served so bravely and unselfishly and completely. It's hard to imagine embodying the school motto more fully than they did. But there's a different moral, I think, and I certainly came away with it in a way haunted by that line and thinking about it. And it has to do with gratitude and privilege. To hear my friend that he never finished his days at Taft because he was fighting in Okinawa reminds us of how fortunate we all are, all of us. Whoever you are, from wherever you came, when you enrolled here, you acquired a level of educational fortune so rare and so thin it cannot be measured. Compared to any group of teenagers in the state, in the country, in the globe, you have an opportunity that is so valuable it cannot be priced. You are simply one of the luckiest on the globe. Now, to be clear, you should not feel guilty about that. I was given the same gift, and I don't. But you should never, ever take it for granted. And maybe that's the final lesson of that lunch. You should remember that very few have the chance, and you should honor that opportunity and the gift of making the most of your days by doing all that you can to better yourself and to better the school. Now, you're all about to end the year. I wish you the very best on exams and papers and portfolios. I know you'll do well. I know your energies have been depleted. Hang in there. Muster up all the strength and focus you can to do as well as you can. And then summer will come, and with it, the time for respite and restoration, maybe even reflection. And I might suggest that even among those 3 months, that at some quiet moment, you think of a man who quietly, and as an aside, mentioned that he never had a graduation because he was fighting in Okinawa, and that you might return to Taft in September, having asked and maybe even answered the question, how can I honor the privilege that I've been given? It's a question I think about almost every day, and I certainly did at that lunch with those wonderful men. So it's in that spirit, and we're giving you an assignment, if you will, over the summer that you have a question to think about. I wish you the very best on the exams. I hope you do well. I hope you have a wonderful summer. I cannot wait to see you all in September. And we will end on a more upbeat note with the dance for the movie for the Hawaiian dance, I think it is. So thank you very much.